President Trump made exaggerated claims about election vulnerabilities in his primetime address. The roughly 25-minute speech, coming just under 4 months until the midterm elections, focused on conspiracy theories that Trump's own intelligence agencies have repeatedly examined and rejected, as well as bipartisan commissions in their direct aftermath. The president declassified intelligence documents that he suggested would prove his claims. Instead, he overstated the details and made claims that didn't match the actual conclusions by the intelligence community. One of his false claims was that China carried out the largest compromise of election data in history, he said, resulting in China's illicit acquisition of 220 million U.S. voter files. The underlying intelligence said something considerably smaller, that China had previously purchased 2020 voter data from 7 states, which you can do, fully legal. In fact, voter data is often available for the public to freely download. The president also highlighted a report from the CIA that Venezuela could tamper with voting machines. But the material released by his administration shows Venezuela had some capability in manipulating electronic voting systems, but that applies to Venezuelan elections, not elections here in the United States. The clearest rebuttal of these false claims came from one of Trump's own appointees, actually, John Solomon. He's a former journalist, prominent election denier, and member of Trump's election task force, one of the guys looking into all this. He told MS Now after attending the speech, quote, "The intelligence community has zero evidence that someone, a foreign power, flipped a vote in 2020, 22, or 24. So no one changed any votes. That wasn't happening." And the president also made this claim last night.
According to the DHS review, state voter rolls and public records, they identified approximately 278,000 non-citizens who are registered to vote in federal elections. Since Democrat states refuse to share their voter files, the real number is actually much higher than that.
As the New York Times points out, Trump's statement appears to be based on a document released by the White House yesterday from the Department of Homeland Security. It claims to have found more than 250,000 non-citizens registered in California, New Jersey, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. The paper notes that the document offered no other details of how it arrived at such a big number and added that those 4 states don't use the SAVE system, a resource administered by the Department of Homeland Security to verify citizenship status. Also, registering doesn't mean they're voting, and that's a huge distinction, too. A lot of distinctions to be made with White House correspondent for The Hill, Julia Manchester, who was up late watching the speech and joins us now, a little bit sleep-deprived, but we're happy to have you. Can you talk a little bit about what the president said last night that actually doesn't match with the underlying evidence, whether it's from bipartisan assessments of what happened in 2020, whether it's assessments of people who he says were voting who aren't voting? I mean, just talk about the things that stood out the most to you.
Well, I think overall there was no smoking gun.
Yeah.
A lot of these documents that were made available last night were already available. There wasn't really anything terribly new. In fact, Trump's CIA director, John Ratcliffe, was in Congress when we saw that that report on the 2020 presidential election that showed there was no foreign interference in the election. So, nothing terribly new here. And I think critics are saying, look, this is President Trump preparing a narrative for November in the midterm elections in the case that Republicans perform poorly, whether it's for him to find a fall person, blame Republicans who maybe didn't act on the Save America Act or did not act on, in his words, securing U.S. elections, blaming Democrats for that as well, or potentially preparing a narrative to say, look, this election was rigged, there was fraud, this is why we got this outcome. Obviously, there is no evidence for that as of now. So it'll be interesting to see how this press briefing by Markwayne Mullin, the DHS secretary, goes later today to see what more findings there are there. But seriously, it doesn't seem like there's anything clearly new in these findings.
I think you're right to point out that a lot of this was already known, that some key Trump allies who are currently serving him now, Ratcliffe among them, were in the intelligence community helping to make and shape some of these assessments in the immediate aftermath of Trump's first term ending and the Biden term beginning. It also really portends the idea, and this is something that we were talking about yesterday leading up to the speech, of foreign influence or attempts to influence are not new, but interference and the actual flipping of votes, tangible changing, There is no proof of that. There never has been. The Trump administration, or rather Trump allies, have tried to push that narrative for years. It failed in courts after he lost in 2020. Certainly there is nothing new here now. And it sort of begs the question of why do this speech at all?
No, absolutely. And look, I think it comes down to the politics. My colleague Niall Stanage put it perfectly in his column last night. His takeaways, Democrats hate the message, love the politics of this going into the midterms in terms of, saying it's not good to, bolster these election claims. But look, once again, Democrats can say, look, Republicans led by President Trump are talking about anything but affordability and those cost of living issues. And I think there's probably, it'll be interesting to hear from Republicans today. I think a lot of Republicans were very quiet last night, and this gives Democrats an attack line they can use on the campaign trail.
Is this also, you were talking about what this might be a precursor towards, right? Because the politics of it, reviving this 2020 big lie, not presenting any new evidence, you're right. It's bad politics, especially given the issue landscape right now. But what is this meant to build a foundation for? Is it just more pressure on the SAVE Act, or is it something that is more concerning, which is because of all of these things that we've presented, which are baseless, but still the White House is going to say they've presented them. Is this why they want to put ICE at polling places, which remains illegal? And yet that is one of the things that we're forced to grapple with. Is that what they're building a foundation for?
I think it could be both. I think there is a pressure campaign to get Senate Republicans to somehow pass the SAVE Act, by any means necessary, including eliminating the filibuster. And I think, there's also this, potential idea from President Trump that if Republicans don't pass the SAVE Act, he can blame Senate Republicans for this, saying, look, I laid out all of this ahead of the election. You still didn't pass the SAVE Act, and this is where we are now. Then there's also the thinking that this could be laying the groundwork for, other moves, whether it's ICE at polling places or whether it's claiming widespread election fraud.
And you're right that Secretary Markwayne Mullin is going to be doing some kind of press something at some point today. And this is one of the questions that he's going to be asked, which is, will you assure that ICE will not be at polling places? And we've heard him waffle on this question before, just as a lot of other administration officials have. And frankly, Todd Blanche, with a completely wrong reading of the law around who is allowed in terms of federal agents at polling places, you're starting to see that there's foundational reason why Democrats are concerned about this and other related questions, especially after a primetime speech like this. I know that you're going to stay on it. White House correspondent for The Hill, Julia Manchester, thank you for coming on with us this morning.